Many many in the room and around the world know Professor Putnam for his amazing work on bowling alone. Experts are probably somewhat like myself, are somewhat more attached, especially these days, to making democracy work, which influenced my work immensely. It was published in 1993, and it's a beautiful, beautiful essay on how northern communities in Italy kind of created democracy. It is work that I really recommend to all of you. It is so relevant to what is going on right now. It is almost a mirror image of our society as we know it today, and it's just a must read for those of you who haven't read it. In precisely these days where democracy is so much under threat. But I want to thank Dr. Boris Mintz for his generosity that allowed us to host one in a generation scholar like Robert Putnam, the divine intervention of Gila Menachem, who a close friend and was a crucial help in bringing him in, and particularly Professor Putnam himself for making the time to talk to us 30 years later, your thoughts, which I believe will come up in this lecture. So thank you very much.
Perhaps if I'll stand behind the podium here. I generally don't like to speak behind a podium, but I'm delighted to be here, so I will stand behind the podium. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be back at Tel Aviv University. Most of you won't know that I also have a degree from Tel Aviv University, although I did not earn it. I have an unearned, I'm very proud of the fact that I have an honorary degree from Tel Aviv University. Now about 12 years old, something like that. So I'm glad to be here. And I'm especially glad to be in the context of this important series of meetings, and I hope I'm going to leave enough time to have some conversation and questions and answers and disagreements with what I'm going to say. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes. So I want to start with the very short run. I'll stay here. I usually like to wander, but I'll stay here behind the podium. I'm going to begin, eventually I'm going to step back and give a much longer perspective, but I want to begin with last November's election. Some of you will have noted that there was an election in America last November, which had a somewhat surprising outcome, to some people a surprising outcome. But the first thing I want to say is that our national election in November of 2024 was not exceptional. It was a completely normal election. First of all, that our 2024 election was not a landslide, although the winner, Donald Trump, wants to claim it was a landslide. It was absolutely not a landslide and did not have by American historical standards. In FDR, in 1936, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had a huge victory, 24% of the popular vote. By the way, I'm going to use popular vote here, but the same thing is true if you just look at the Electoral College, this strange way we have of counting votes. He won the election by 24 percentage points, and that led naturally to the New Deal. It was a big vote and naturally a big outcomes. And in 1964, Johnson won by 24%, a big vote, landslide, and it led to big changes. The Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, enormous changes in American politics and society and economics. Or in 1984, Ronald Reagan won the election by 18%. Big difference, and led to the Reagan Revolution. So both Republicans and Democrats in recent past, or at least in the 20th century, had major victories that led to major changes. Donald Trump's victory was trivial, frankly. It was one of the closest elections, not a landslide, one of the closest elections in American history, and he has no mandate. He claims a mandate, but he doesn't have a mandate. And it was a normal election in another sense. Everyone agrees that the underlying reason for Trump's victory was the economy, the high inflation, or higher inflation than people liked. But elections are almost always about the economy, stupid, almost always. And that's not a big deal because the economy goes up and the economy goes down, and when it goes up, it's good for whoever's in charge, and when it goes down, it's bad for whoever's in charge. And when the economy turns, as it seems to be doing right now in America because of Trump's fixation with tariffs and so on, the political pendulum reverses. So the first thing I want to do is to deflate any concern about last November's election. But I also want to make a point, and some more important points, I would say, about the deeper significance, historical significance of that election. It was a major, significant signpost. Trump did not create a polarized, atomized America, as we're in now. He exploited it. He exploited what I've described as bowling alone. And you may think that's Bob Putnam trying to claim prescience, foresight, but actually Steve Bannon, who's Trump's guru, has said recently that my discovery, this strange Harvard professor discovered declining social capital, and that was the basis for their strategy, political strategy. They looked at bowling alone and they said, well, there are a lot of lonely people out there, and they're going to be attracted or vulnerable to appeals that are populist and authoritarian. And it turns out that's right. The best predictor of who voted for Trump was low social capital. But it's not just me saying that, and I apologize to you all for the fact that by publishing Bowling Alone, I gave guidelines to Trump's victory. And the worst of the problems is that trend that I described in Bowling Alone 25 years ago, now 25 years later, is getting worse still. Pardon me. That in the book Bowling Alone, I looked at the previous 25 years, and I said there's been this decline in social capital. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Raise your hand if you have ever heard the term social capital. Okay, so I don't have to explain it. Well, raise your hand if you know sort of what social capital means. It means social networks. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. And the absence of social capital is social isolation, where people are they're bowling alone. The real historical threat, I've just said that the election outcome itself is not a big deal, not unusual, But the real significance of this election is that it showed we still have growing isolation, social isolation. It's getting worse. It's not just as bad as it was 25 years. It's much worse than it was 25 years ago, and it's still getting worse. More and more people in America are isolated. And moreover, there's a growing class gap in social isolation. And now, in order to illustrate this, I'm going to draw in part on two of my own recent works, a work called The Upswing and a work called Our Kids. And I'm going to now summarize. The Upswing is a book, was the last book I published, actually the last book I will publish. I kept telling my wife, Rosemary, who wanted me to retire, I kept saying, well, I'll just publish, this will be my last book. And then I published my last book. But Upswing is my last book. I published it jointly with a brilliant young woman named Shailene Romney Garrett. Now, I'm going to show you, not going to summarize everything about this about this book, but I wanted to show you a few simple graphs. And if you like numbers, your time has come. And if you don't like numbers, that's okay. Just settle back and close your eyes and take a snooze. And if Putnam says anything interesting, someone else will nudge you and wake you up. Anyhow, I'm going to tell the story in addition to showing it. And I'm going to start with this. Well, this is what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you that today, in hard, measurable terms, I'm a counter. I count things, and this is not just my impressions, this is what the data show. America has reached extreme levels of political polarization. There's only one period in American history in which we've had polarization anything like what we have now, and that was the period between 1860 and 1865. Raise your hands if you know what that period between 1860 and 1865 in America was. The Civil War. So we're at that level. I don't mean we're yet actually in a physical civil war, but that's politically, that's how extreme it has gotten. And moreover, and independently of that, America has probably never been as unequal economically. The gap between rich folks and poor folks in America has almost certainly never been as great as it is right now. And I'm going to show you some numbers about that. And in addition, separately from that, social isolation has almost never, probably never been as great as it is now. Now, we have less good historical data going back into the 19th or 18th century, so I'm a little less sure about really long ago, but certainly we have good data, which I'm going to show you over the last 125 years. And over that last 125 years, I don't think we've ever seen a period of as great social isolation as we have now. And finally, and I'm not going to have time to explain how I measure this, but I wish I could. If you wanted to ask me how I'm measuring cultural self-centeredness, please do, because I'm really proud of how we measure that, but I'm not going to go, this is not mainly a methodological talk. So the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to an extremely polarized, extremely unequal, extremely socially isolated, and extremely self-centered America? And I'm going to use some graphs here. I'm going to start with polarization, and I'm going to spend a little time on this chart just so that because they all have the same form, so if you understand this graph, you'll understand the later ones. Let's do the horizontal axis. The horizontal axis is time, and over here is now. Actually, since I'm drawing data from a book that was published in 2020 and was the data analysis was finished in about 2015. This chart, it looks a little bit 10 years out of date, but actually it's not, because we know now, I do know exactly how all these graphs what's happened since we published the book, and the answer is it's gone down here. So in all of the graphs, if we had 2025 over here, it's just kept going. Things have gotten worse. But over there, we're going back, roughly speaking, 125 years. So we're looking at the last century and a quarter, from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st century. Does that make sense? Do you understand the horizontal axis? And the vertical axis is some measure of politics or economics or society or culture. And they're all oriented so that up is good. That just simply makes it easier to explain what I'm doing. And so here, up is political comedy, bipartisanship, getting along politically, and down is polarization. Okay, so far? And so you can see that we're now very polarized here. But over on the left side, at the end of the 19th century, we were also very polarized. American politics at the end of the 19th century was tribal, as our politics has now become very tribal. And as I said, if we continued that chart that way to 1860, 1865, we were even more polarized. That's what I meant when I said we're really polarized. Now by now, since we're over here, we're down in Civil War territory. That's what I mean by polarization. But then if you follow the graph forward, you can see that beginning in the first years of the 20th century, roughly speaking around 1900, 1910, we're still very polarized. It's still very low in absolute terms, but the trend is a little bit upward. And you can see that the trend of polarization, well, the trend of depolarization continues. It goes up in the teens and 20s, and there's a little bit of a pause in the early 20s, but then it keeps going up and up. And by the time you get to World War II in 1940, 1945, it's quite high, but then it still keeps going up further. And by the middle 50s, America is remarkably bipartisan. In the 1950s, we had a president named Dwight Eisenhower, who was the least partisan president in American history, the least partisan president in American history, except for George Washington, who founded our country. Raise your hand if you've heard of George Washington. Okay, yeah. Actually, I'm curious. Raise your hand if you've heard of Dwight Eisenhower. Excellent. Okay, so Dwight Eisenhower was very nonpartisan. He was almost nominated. He was nominated in the end by Republicans, but he could easily have been nominated by Democrats. He just sort of flipped a coin and said, okay, I'll not be run as a Republican. He didn't cause the depolarization. He reflected the depolarization. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in the middle 50s and even into the 60s, America had a very bipartisan politics. Most major legislation was passed on bipartisan lines with large numbers of Republicans and large numbers of Democrats. That was even true in the middle 60s, that's the period of LBJ's Great Society legislation. And you're going to find this hard to believe, most of LBJ's Great Society legislation and civil rights legislation and so on was supported by more Republicans than Democrats. And even more striking, by the time we get to the early 1980s, we're a little more polarized, you can see that there, but a substantial proportion of Reaganomics was supported by both Republicans and Democrats. So in that period, we're very bipartisan, but you can see what happens, and it's a little boring actually, because it just keeps going down every year. We're more and more polarized, and you can see, as I said, we're now down here someplace. Okay, I hope you understand now how to read the charts. Horizontal axis is time, old, now, and the vertical axis is, in this case, political polarization. Now let's look at economic inequality. I'm sorry, I guess I'm the guy who's running this. These chart actually doesn't strictly speaking begin until 1914, which is when our Internal Revenue Service was created. So after that, we have really good data on income distribution because the IRS had to collect data on people's income. But we have pretty good evidence even before then. So if you go back into the 1890s, that was what's called the Gilded Age of at the end of the American Industrial Revolution, huge, enormous fortunes. I mean, you could see it right in the island of Manhattan. On the Upper East Side, there were the mansions of the Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgan and all the major robber barons of the American Industrial Revolution. And just 10 miles south of there, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, were the poor and huddled masses, many of them Jewish immigrants from the shtetl. who had essentially no income at all. So that was a period of great inequality in American life. That I'm referring to the period around 1900. Now we begin to see how it rose. But as I say, beginning in the middle of the teens, the 19-teens, we were still very unequal, but we were becoming a little less unequal. Do you see that? And then there's a little bit of a pause during the 1920s. That was a period in which the stock market was booming and unemployment was high, so we went down and became less equal. But then, even before the Depression, the measure of economic equality began to rise, and it goes up through the 30s and 40s, and it became quite high in the mid-1940s. That's, of course, World War II. That's when there was wage and price controls. Government controls prevented there from being a big gap. But then, even in the 1950s and 1960s, America was incredibly equal. I want you to know we were really equal. I want you to guess the two countries in the world that were the most equal, the most absolutely equal distribution of income or wealth or property. So here's the first guess. Sweden. Right, that's right. And what was the other really equal country? Like, socialist Sweden was very equal, and capitalist America was tied with socialist Sweden. You're shocked. We were, in my lifetime, an incredibly equal country. But that didn't last long. You can see in the 1970s, and then especially after 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, we became steadily less and less equal. It's going down, down, down. In the Obama years of sort of the middle, around, roughly speaking, 2015, it looked like, okay, at last this is, but then it kept going. The two Trump administrations drove this number further down, and so now that number is down here. And again, we're probably the most unequal period in American history. Maybe the Gilded Age, when we had the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgans and so on, and the huddled immigrant masses, maybe that. But I mean, that's where we are now. That's the same territory we're in now. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Here I'm going to be, if I say social capital, most of you will know what I mean, but here I'm going to call it social cohesion. And this is a measure of the degree to which people are connected to other people. Do they know their neighbors? Do they trust their neighbors? Do they belong to civic organizations? Do they belong to clubs? Do they belong to bowling teams? To take the example from the title of the book, Bowling Alone. And do they trust other people? Do they trust their neighbors? And do they go to dinner parties with their neighbors? Do they go on picnics? And if you've not read Bowling Alone, you may be surprised to know that I actually have at least for part of this period, the annual picnic archive of America. So I know that between 1970 and 1990, the number of picnics, the average picnics in America, do you know what a picnic, raise your hand if you know what a picnic is. Yes, surely you do know what a picnic is. It's people getting together and having hot dogs or something. And the average number of picnics between roughly 1970 and roughly 1990 fell from 5 picnics a year to 2 picnics a year. There was a national picnic crisis. And what I'm being joking, but I'm also trying to be serious. Every measure you can find of people getting together, dinner parties fell a lot over that period. They fell by more than half. That was comforting to Rosemary and me, because people had stopped inviting us to dinner parties, and we thought maybe we were something wrong with us that we didn't. But nobody was having dinner parties. That was during that period. And so those are the kinds of things I'm measuring here: trust, connections with other people, even family connections. And you can see now, I'll describe very quickly the historical trend. Back in the 1890s, Americans were very socially isolated. Why were we socially isolated then? Because of widespread migration and immigration many, many millions of Americans had moved from the farm to the city, whether the farm was in the shtetl or the farm was in Sicily or the farm was in Iowa, and they'd moved to Chicago or New York. And they'd left their family and friends and institutions behind in the old country, and they hadn't yet made new friends and made new connections. So at that period, we were, for an obvious reason, we were a society disconnected and very low in social cohesion, very low in social capital. But then, as you can see, gradually that we began to become a little more connected because people began to know their neighbors and build new institutions, and that was certainly true for all immigrant groups. All immigrant groups began to create new, the Sons of Italy, or the Sons of Ireland, or the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was a famous, still exists actually, to help newly arrived Jews get their feet on the ground. And again, you see that beginning to rise. There's that pause in the 1920s. I don't know how to explain that, but it keeps going up and up and up, and keeps going up during that. Now, Bob Putnam appears on the scene. Well, he's born in 1941, but he really, is in school and high school and just about to enter college in the late 1950s, in the 1960s. And that's just about the time that this long boom of ever-increasing connections, social capital, begins to reverse. So a plausible causal hypothesis is that I personally caused the collapse of American society. But of course, as a good social scientist, I'm entertaining other possible explanations besides that I did it. And we'll have a chance to come back to what might be causing this. But then, as you see, into the 70s and 80s, down, 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 and it just keeps, Bowling Alone was published here, based on data here, but people have replicated my work since, and it's a straight line. It's just, now keep that in mind, because remember what I was saying at the very outset when we've got this problem of, the real problem is not the election of last November. The real problem is that underneath the election is that the problems were, the social isolation problem is getting worse. And that's the data. It's just getting worse and worse, and it's still getting worse. We haven't begun to address that problem. So that's the social cohesion picture. I'll show you the next slide, which is about cultural solidarity. This is the degree to which Americans have thought of themselves as being all in this together. We're all neighbors, we're all connected, we share a lot of things. Or alternatively, do we think we're not all in this together, that it's every man or woman for himself, sauf qui peut. And that, as I say, I have really good measures of that, but I'm not going to, until you ask me, I'm not going to tell you exactly how we measured it, but you'll trust me. Actually, please do trust me. Everything I'm telling you is true. So you'll trust me, but if you don't trust me, then you can ask the questions later. How did you measure cultural solidarity? But now the graph itself is boring. You can wake up anybody who's been sleeping through all the graphs, because now I want to just say, this is exactly the same chart, right? You think I must have made this up, but I didn't. At the end of the 19th century, Americans were very self-centered, and they're worried about me. But then in the beginning of the 20th century, our statistical data shows people began to become a little more concerned about other people. That's a very important point. I'm going to come back to that point later. Again, you see the same pause during the 20s, but then it keeps going up, more and more sense that we're all in this together. And so by the time we reach the peak here in the early 1960s, America's a society of love. That's the summer of love in America. And everybody, I don't mean everybody loves everybody, but we're, relatively speaking, for a major society, we have a remarkable degree of a sense that we're all in this together. And then Putnam starts to vote, of course, and then that causes the collapse of American civilization, and you can see the decline in a sense of social solidarity, and it keeps going down and down and down. And actually, the most recent data show it's now, well, not here, but it's down there someplace. So these graphs even though they're measured separately, and one's about politics, and one's about economics, and one's about society, and one's about culture, they all tell the same story, so let's put them all together. That's the chart. That's a single chart that accurately describes patterns of social change in America over the last 125 years. And I sort of almost want to stop here, because that's the main empirical finding. Does that make sense so far? I mean, I've tried to summarize all that's happened in America over the last 125 years. We started in a bad place, then we began to move into a better place. We began to, in the middle of the 20th century, we began to be remarkably equal, remarkably consensual, remarkably connected, remarkably centered on we, and then Putnam starts to vote, and everything collapses. And we're back where we started, or in some cases worse. Now, I want to pause here for a minute, and now begin to, I'm done, or almost done with the charts, so wake up people who've been sleeping doing the numbers, and I'm now going to draw some conclusions. It'll take me a little while here to draw conclusions. Gila, when am I going to get pulled off the stage? Do I have another 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe? I want to leave time for Q&A. Yeah, what am I'm going to be pulled off the stage at 11? Yes. Okay, so I'll keep going quickly. Sorry, one more thing I wanted to say. Remember back at the beginning when I said there were big changes in America? And I said that one of the changes was this increasing polarization, increasing social isolation, and you've seen now that's true for increasing inequality and increasing self-centeredness. Another thing I said back then was that these were not just nationwide trends affecting everybody. They're trends that are class biased. The trends are least bad for college-educated Americans and worse for the lower two-thirds of Americans who did not finish college. That's a simple division in America. If you finished college, actually, I know the numbers might not be the same here, but raise your hand if you have finished 4 years of higher education. Okay, in America, all of you would be in the upper class, that is the upper two-thirds, just by having a college education. And many of the rest of you are on your way there, I know, because you're still completing your baccalaureate degree. Okay. The main point I want to make is that the trends there are the same trends of social isolation among college-educated Americans, but they're much worse among non-college educated Americans. And that's not just an interesting fact, that's crucial to what happened last November. So let me get back to the trends that I want to. Here's the data. This is not actually my data, it's from a conservative source, but the data are very clear. On the left-hand side, you have trends between 1900 and now, to 2024, trends of the fraction of all Americans who have they're totally socially isolated. And you can see the people who have a college degree is the lower blue line. There are more socially isolated college-educated people, goes from 2% to 10%, but way more socially isolated working-class Americans. Is that clear? I mean, it goes from 3% to 24%. And on the other extreme, how many Americans have at least 6 close friends? It's going down among the blue-lined college graduates, but it's going way down. Almost very few, only 17% of working-class Americans have as compared to 49% just a quarter century ago. Now, what does that mean? It turns out that is actually highly relevant to the outcome of the last election. Because it's not just that people were socially isolated. Remember, Bannon was flaunting the fact that he'd taken evidence from me, but now what we see is it's especially working class Americans who are increasingly social isolated, and that would lead you to think that probably Trump's strategy works even better with working class people, and we know that's true. And the only problem for Democrats is there are a lot more working class people than there are college educated people. So the good guys, Democrats, I'm not a Republican. I think many Republicans are nice, but I'm worried about America right now. In America right now, the Democrats have this problem that not only we're getting fewer and fewer of our kinds of people are actually paying attention to us. Doesn't matter about our policies, they're turning, and I'm not going to say much about this now, but I will mention this because if you want to come, it's really important. What's happening in America, this graph doesn't show it, but I have other data that shows it, and other people have found the same thing, is that the main line of cleavage in American politics, which for hundreds of years has been race, is now gradually being replaced by class. We are becoming much more a class-divided society, and therefore much more like actually traditional European societies. And I don't know exactly what's happening here in Israel. I mean, I do, but I don't know how to say it in terms of class terms. But it's a big deal. What I've just finished saying is a big deal because, let me decode that. What does it mean? It means that increasingly working class blacks and working class whites are on the same side. They're on the Trump side. And increasingly middle class blacks and middle class whites are also on the same side, but they're on the Democratic side. The problem is the middle class is smaller than the working class, still. Does that make sense? I mean, I didn't have a graph to show you that, but don't forget that fact that America is becoming increasingly class-based. Our divisions are class-based rather than race-based. Okay, so now let me start with a summary. I've got several summaries, but this is the first of the summaries. Here's what I want to say. The fundamental causes of our democratic crisis are, first of all, that we have a shriveled sense of we. We no longer think of ourselves as a we. We think of ourselves as a collection of me's. I. And that's a big problem for America. It's what lies upstream from our polarization. Because we just don't think of America as being a we, as we did. And I know that we did because I was living there. But let me pause for a second. Rosemary and I have 7 grandchildren. I'm very proud of the 7 grandchildren. They're wonderful people. They're in their 20s, almost all of them in their 20s. And they're nice people, but they have never experienced in America in which you didn't have to lock your door. I tell my grandchildren, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and we didn't lock our door, and they think Grandpa must be losing it. He must be becoming senile because he thinks that there was a time when Americans didn't lock their door. There was a time. But that whole generation, more than a whole generation, but certainly our grandchildren, they may believe Grandpa spinning tales about history, but in their whole life experience, America has been untrustworthy and isolated and unequal and angry. That's the thing to keep in mind. That's most Americans. Not many Americans are my age. A lot of Americans are their age. The second thing is that we have increased social isolation. That's what, way back at the beginning of the talk, I said that's what Steve Bannon recognized. And also J.D. Vance, by the way, has also said the same thing. Putnam was right because he told us where we had to aim our strategy, these socially isolated people. But now it's increasingly class-based. And you saw the evidence for that. And another point I want to make, I haven't shown you data on this, but the problem is not just economics. It's recognition. Do people like us even recognize these people on the other side of the line? I think I have a quote here later on from Hillary Clinton. I was a strong supporter of Hillary Clinton. I still am. And Rosemary and I actually happen to be friends of Hillary Clinton. We spent some time with her not long ago. But when she talked about the deplorables, you may not have heard that, but in the election in which she was running, she referred to the Trump people as the deplorables. It was not, she was feeding into this narrative that we despise the working class. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And that is as much as the fact that they don't have the same income as us. They think in our eyes they don't count. And they're right. Okay, I want to go back to this graph just for a second. When people look at that graph, the first thing they want to know is what happened up there? Why did we change? And the short answer to that is the 60s. But that, I'm not going to spend any time on that, honestly, because that's not the most interesting period. For us here, the most interesting period is this period. Because that's when America was in a plight like us now. Do you see what I'm trying to say? If we have lessons from history, it's that period of history, not this period of history. I was there. It was a nice time in American history. The 60s was a rather nice time in America, but it was not perfect. So the trick here is not to go back. The trick is to go back to that period. The trick is to figure out what did they know, because somebody back there did it. And that's the point of the book, The Upswing, because, and here are the 4 lessons there are many lessons, but here are the 4 lessons that I want you to carry away with. And now I am coming near the end of my talk, so there will be time for questions. First of all, that period, let me remind you of the period, that period over there, the lower left-hand side, that in American historiography, that's called the progressive era. That's just the name of that. They weren't all leftists. Indeed, there were a lot of progressives who were Republicans and a lot of progressives who were Democrats, but it was called the progressive era. And the first thing to say is the people who did it were young people. And this is almost always true. Old people like me have a role to play, because we know, I can say to my grandchildren, actually, I know it was better than this. It doesn't have to be like this. I know my personal experience tells me that at least until I started to vote, America was doing fine. So old people have a role to play as, grouchers, people who say it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe our role is to be hope providers. But the people who are going to, in any revolutionary period, the people who are going to have the ideas that are going to work in the years ahead, the people who know how to make America, who will know how to make America better in the 2050s, I'm long gone, but it's my grandchildren, it's young people today who are going to have the ideas that lead to a better place for America. Does that make sense? And so, therefore, I'm trying to explain why it was true, but it certainly was true that the leading progressives back in that earlier period were almost all people in their 20s. A few people younger than 20, almost nobody over 30. So it's the 20-somethings then, and it will be the 20-somethings right now. My grandchildren, not just metaphorically, but actually my real grandchildren, are going to be the ones who are going to have to fix it. Secondly, it was a bottom-up process. It did not begin at the top. There were national leaders like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to come back to Teddy Roosevelt in a second. He was a progressive leader and helped to usher in some of these changes around 1910. But he was like the leader, and the famous leader, apocryphal leader in the French Revolution, who saw a parade going and ran to get in front of it, because the real ideas of the progressive era, the real policy ideas, came from the grassroots 15 or 20 years earlier. So, 1, it's young people. 2, it's grassroots. 3, and this is going to be the point I'm going to emphasize as I finish now. I'm not quite done, but I promise I'm now getting close to the end. You might wonder, well, we've talked about 4 things, right? Economics, politics, society, and culture. And we've got good data, so we can look at what I want to make sure you're hearing me. We can look at what economists call leading indicators. We can look to see, well, which of these things turned first, because that'll give us some clue as to what we want to work on now. Does that make sense? We're looking for leading indicators. And I was sure that I knew what the leading indicators. All Americans think it's about economics, stupid. And so I thought, well, first of all, we would have had the economy would have turned, and then after that, other things would have happened. So we ought to focus on economics. The one thing I can tell you for certain is that is simply not true. Economic equality was the last thing to change. It's not that economic inequality is unimportant. We should fix it, but that's not going to be the secret ingredient. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Something else was. Well, so what was that? And now I'm going to shock you. shocked myself, actually, when we saw the data. The first thing to change was that moral curve, that cultural curve. And what does that mean in real life? What that meant was people first had to start thinking they had obligations to other people. And so the key back then was young people, meaning people in their 20s, had to come to think that they had obligations, especially rich young people back then, had to, and therefore especially kids like my grandchildren aren't yet rich, but they're well off. They will be well off. I'm determined they're going to be well off. People like them had to come to think that they had obligations to other people on the other side of the class barrier, on the other side of the tracks. And so I'm now going to, I'm going to finish with a story, but let me just say the last fourth point was, I'm not trying to say the progressive area was perfect. It was not. There were, some of the progressives were racist, actually. And so I'm happy to talk more about the fact that this time around we want the we to become more inclusive and include not just, well, the last time it included women, because that's when women got the suffrage exactly then. So it was not, but it was almost always a white, that was almost always a white progressive movement. I'm happy to talk more about race in the progressive era, but for now I'm just setting it aside. It was not inclusive enough. But I want to now finish by focusing on this, I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, I promise now I am at the end, so I'll have to be quick here. In 1910, there was a famous event called the Shirtwaist Triangle Factory Disaster. Now what that meant was, down on the lower east side of New York, there was what was called a sweatshop. There were many, many sweatshops in which young immigrant women, largely young Jewish immigrant women from the shtetl, had migrated to New York City, lived nearby there, and they, when they were in their teens, sometimes even younger, they went to this big building, tall building, the Shirtwaist Triangle building, and the employer, who happened also to be Jewish, was afraid they were going to sneak out for a smoke, or maybe try to sneak some of the shirts, the dresses that they were making, sneak those out. And so he nailed the doors shut. And there was a fire, and there was no way for them to get out. Now, that's evil. But what happened next was even more evil. What did they do? They jumped. Roughly 150 young women jumped to their death from the Shirtwaist Triangle factory. Obscene. Rosemary and I recently were there. I mean, the building is no longer there, but there's a memorial there, and you can look up and imagine thud. I'm trying to get you to feel the horror of that. Meanwhile, on that same morning, on the other side of the square, there was a young debutante, a young rich lady, having tea with other debutantes. And they heard the fire engines and the noise, and so they ran out. And one of them, I'll share her name with you in a second, but one of them went over, actually. She was a rich debutante. She was planning to get married. She was from wealthy people, and she was planning to get married to a rich stockbroker or something. But she had actually she'd worked with Jane Addams, a reformer in Chicago at Hull House, so she had a little bit of knowledge about social reform. Anyway, but still, she's going to be a fine, upstanding, rich wife of somebody. She looked up, and she had a moral epiphany. That's the point I'm making, a moral epiphany. And she said to herself, "That is evil. And I am somehow implicated in this because I'm well off, but I didn't prevent those. There was no fire regulations. I want you to feel the moral indignation that she felt." So the next day she was well connected, of course, she was well off. She went to the mayor of the city of New York and said, "Name me fire commissioner." And over the next couple of years, she pushed her way into New York city government and then in New York state government. She became friends of a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you'll have heard later on. Franklin Delano Roosevelt made this young woman, whose name was Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member in American history. She turns out she was the author of our Social Security system, our basic safety net in America. She was the author of unemployment compensation. She was the author of child labor laws. All going back, you see the point I'm making now? All going back to that one moment of moral clarity in which she realized she had an obligation to other people, not just to herself. It's the fundamental, it's our God who said, love thy neighbor as thyself. And most people in that period didn't. Frances Perkins did. And that's why we had, at least for a long time, an improving life in America. I want to just close with two quotations. Well, I want to say, forget that. This is the first quotation. This is a guy named Elon Musk. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Elon Musk. It's really hard to believe. You know, not even a month and a half ago, Elon Musk said and bragged about the fact he said it, the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Not the failure of empathy, absent, but empathy. That's the climate of America today. That's the moral climate of America today, at least unless we change it. But this is the moral climate a century or 125 years ago. This is Theodore Roosevelt. The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule that underlines all else, is that on the whole and in the long run we go up or down together. So that's the moral message I'm bringing to you. And if there were young people here, you know, I don't know what any of this applies to Israel. But when I speak to American audiences, I'm trying to say to young people, this is you. It's only going to get fixed if you start worrying about other people. Thank you for your time.
It is a very rare occasion to have such a scholar as Robert Putnam, so we will actually allocate you an extra 10 minutes just to be fair to the audience who may have questions. So the way it works now is those of you who want to ask questions, and that better be good ones, or otherwise.
So first of all, I would like to thank you for a very inspiring talk and also for your friendship with Tel Aviv University, and I think and for your willingness to come to visit us in a time like that. And I have a question regarding perhaps unintended consequences of events that were positive, like women's liberations and civil rights movements. Maybe on the one hand they were positive, but also led to identity politics and undermining family values and so forth.
Yes. Sorry, I've got to use this mic. Did you all hear the question? The question is, did things that seemed good at the time, and maybe were good, like with the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement and so on, in the 60s, was the unintended consequence of that to focus on identity politics and distract us from other kinds of politics, from the kinds of politics I've been talking about here. And that may be true. And of course, as you know, this is a big issue, or maybe you don't know, but it is a big issue in America right now because the Trump administration is claiming that what's called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is worrying about women and racial minorities and so on, and handicapped people, all those, worrying about the outcasts of our society, Trump claims is evil, wrong. And most of us don't think that. Most of us, my daughter is a professional woman, and I for sure care about her, and because she was married to a Costa Rican immigrant, I have three grandchildren who don't look like me at all. They're not pink like me, they're brown, because they really are Latino. So I have a stake in this. Even though I'm white and male, I'm worrying about my daughter and my grandchildren. Nevertheless, I do think that in terms of national politics, Democrats have allowed ourselves to be put in a position in which we're not worrying about, especially about the working class. Remember, that's what I said. We're not, people, even especially black men, think we're not worrying about them. Well, who else are we supposed to be worrying? We're supposed to be worrying about blacks. But because of this changing structure of conflict, they identify as working class. And so, to come back, I do think that we Democrats, we progressives, have allowed our sights to stray from the fundamental issues, which are not just economic, but are also recognition, cultural. You see what I'm trying to say? And so, to the extent that that the explanation for that is identity politics, I agree with that, with your political analysis, although I repeat, I care about my brown grandchildren and my female grandchildren and my female daughter and so on, and my wife, for the goodness sakes. By the way, I didn't actually introduce my wife, Rosemary, who's sitting right here. You will not know, and you probably don't know that there's now a documentary movie about us, about Rosemary and me, and Bowling Alone. It's called Join or Die. It's on Netflix, but not Netflix in Israel, so we're trying to work to make that happen. Why do I say that? Because Rosemary and I go out to talk, in America, we go out after people show the movie. It's been shown, 300 or 400 times, as well as on Netflix, and we go off into shows, and afterwards we stand up. And what the movie shows is the really smart person in this couple is there here. She gets a standing ovation. Not me. Is that right? Yes.
Thanks so much. That was fantastic. I'll project. Thanks again.
Can you hear back there? Can you hear the question?
Thanks so much. It was fantastic. I wanted to ask you about two factors and how they might actually affect social capital and the trends in social capital. The first being something that I think probably would have had an effect on the growth of social capital into the 1950s and the 1960s in the United States, and that would be collective threat. One type of collective threat would have been the economic one, the Great Depression, obviously. The second was simply a military threat expressed in the two world wars.
Yep.
And then what might be quite concerning is perhaps the American society has to, in order to bind together, it has to face these type of collective threats and that type of magnitude.
Right. I got it.
The second question, the second factor is social media.
Yep. I got it. I know. Can I just? Those are both good questions, and I know what I'm going to say about them. I may not be right, but I know what I'm going to say about them, and I'm going to have other questions too. First of all, war, the Great Depression, external threats. If you look at those graphs, let me see if I can get back to any of them. Whoops, probably this one. Here is where the turn-up starts. Right? This is where the upswing starts. The Great Depression is here. The upswing is long begun before the Great Depression. World War II is here, the upswing was 40 or 50 years old before the Great Depression, and I mean before World War II. But you could say, well, people back in the 20s recognized there was going to be a war with Germany in the 1940s, and so they began making friends or something. But the timing is simply incompatible with the idea. Since causes usually come before effects, the timing is incompatible. There's a lot of other evidence too, but that's the core bit of the evidence. Now, how about social media? There's a ton to say here, and I'm going to try to be quick, but it's a big topic. It's not one question, it's a million questions about social media. First of all, Bowling Alone actually was written 8 years before social media were invented, before Facebook came into being. But when Facebook came into being and social media came into being, everybody in the world, or at least Mark Zuckerberg says, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I mean, you know, no more wars. Everybody's going to love everybody around the world. You have to go back and read that early literature to believe it, because now you wouldn't believe how everybody was. It's going to be just terrific and way better than face-to-faceness, because it's going to be without distance. The academics were a little more cautious as to what the evidence said, but then came COVID, and we became engaged in a big national experiment about what does it look like if we can't meet face-to-face, but we can only meet via Zoom or Facebook. And I don't know about here, but the evidence, I know exactly when the verdict was in on that. It was Thanksgiving Day in 2020, in which millions of Americans, of younger Americans, discovered that hugging grandma was much better than Zooming with grandma. And the grandparents learned that seeing a little postage stamp size of your picture of your grandchildren was not the same thing as hugging them. So that's when people began to realize, oh, well, wait a minute, there's a big difference about this. However, I'm now going to come to the most important part of my answer, which is to say that the framing of the issue, as I sometimes do, bowling leagues versus Facebook. You understand what I'm trying to say? Bowling leagues are face-to-face. Facebook is computer-mediated. That way of framing it is wrong. And so to ask whether it's better to have face-to-face, whether face-to-face or social media are better, because, and this is the main point I want to make, most of our, is there anybody here who's a chemist? I would like it if there's a chemist in the room. None of you are chemists. Okay, well, there's a term from chemistry called an alloy. An alloy is a mixture of two base metals, like tin and copper, and you put them together and you mix them up and you heat them and you stir them and you utter some kind of incantation, and they become something other than just a mixture of tin and copper. They become brass or bronze. I can't remember just what it is, but it's different. Now, keep that alloy, that example or that image in mind. Most of our social networks today are alloys. That is, most of our networks with other people are simultaneously face-to-face and social media or email or something. Let me take Rosemary and me. We do see each other quite often in the course of a day. Her office is 10 feet from my office, but much of the time she emails me to say, you know, the dishes need to be done, Bob. And then I text her back saying, right on it. You see what I'm trying to say is, even in our marriage, our connections are alloys. They're partly face-to-face, of course, but they're also not artificial, but electronically based. Now, why did I make that point? First of all, it's a true fact. Actually, every fact I've given you is a true fact. This is another one of them. We are all linked by alloys, not by just, you know, Facebook or bowling leagues. Now, that is a quite promising thought. Because you could think, well, we could have the best of both worlds. Let's have an alloy that has the best parts of face-to-face or huggingness. There are certainly good parts about that. But there are parts about social media that are great. I mean, you know, it can be longer distances. You can displace in time so that Rosemary, I'm a night person, Rosemary's a morning person. I can send her an email as I go to bed, and she gets up while I'm still sleeping, but she can act on it the next morning. So all the main point I want to make is, wouldn't it be great if we could have the best of both worlds? Yeah, but maybe that's not technical, he said. But now I want to say, I went to Facebook headquarters. Facebook invited me, Bob Putnam, to come and talk to them about social capital. The whole conference was called Social Capital and Facebook. Whoa! And I thought that was great. And I talked to some of their researchers, and one of the researchers said, shh, not only would it be great, we know how to use Facebook. I'm not making this up. I mean, I may be sued by Mark Zuckerberg, but I'm not making this up. This researcher said, we actually know, we did an experiment and we know how to make this alloy work. We know how to use Facebook to make real face-to-face connections. And I said, wonderful. When is it going to appear? And he said, it's not going to appear. And I said, why is that? Is there some technical reason you can't do it? He said, no, technically we've solved it. The problem is when people actually get together over Zoom, but in Facebook-friendly ways, they actually like it. And they don't get angry. And our business model requires anger. Because if you get angry, you're more likely to click. And all of the Facebook money comes from clicks. Now, I may have said something subversive here, but I want you to think deeply about what I've said. You were the one who asked me here about social networks? You, okay. We know it's not a technical problem. We can have the right kind of alloy. It's a business model problem. It's a problem of how to make profit. And I could say much more about that. It seems to me we ought to think of this like highways as a public good, and therefore we ought to have regulations that require people to produce outcomes that are good for everybody, not just the ones that are good for their own pocketbook. I'm guessing that's not going to happen anytime soon, and therefore we're going to have to rely on this strange mixture we have of face-to-face and of mixture of bowling leagues and Facebook. I'm sorry that it went on so long, but I was trying to answer both two good questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now split into two groups. Avit and Gila will escort our wonderful guests to a kind of a private meeting with some of our carefully selected students. And we will stay here with Michael Turner. So I will introduce Michael Turner, but thank you again. Thank you. And Michael Turner is a
challenges of the future. The social scientists will look for the reasons for the crisis, while the humanists may bring a sense of the ideal inherent in human interactions. Okay. A series of revolutions have taken place affecting our lives. The scientific revolution of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, which was key in creating the city we live in, the social revolution as a reaction to the 19th century urban crisis, followed by the speed of change embodied in the futurists. The world wars of the 20th century and the ensuing development brought about the environmental revolution, which was perhaps not related to by Professor Putnam, now being addressed through digital technologies previously thought as science fiction. We are witnessing a global urban polycrisis, which can be summed up in this image, showing the disproportionate use of light between developed and developing countries, the haves and the have-nots, intertwined with human and natural disasters affecting both the collective and the individual. The urban milestones are texts representing actions and reactions to the many crises that are now in the global arena, when we will start from the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Environment, past the UNESCO Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, and the climate extremes of the Making Cities Resilient initiative. For our discussion, we will look today at two milestones. The year 2007, when over 4 billion people living in urban areas overtook the number in rural settings. And in 2032, when, if the trend continues, most of the urban people will be living in conurbations considered metropolises, both crisis and opportunity. Our lives changed around the year 2007, with actions identified by Thomas Friedman in a keynote UN lecture, with images on Instagram, friends on Facebook, renters at Airbnb, communications on WhatsApp, WeChat, payments with PayPal, and travel with Uber and Get Taxi. But he also noted something else which we missed, is that we're moving from the current to the emerging technologies due to the 2008 economic crisis. This tapering off of disruptive innovation can be demonstrated with the Encyclopedia Britannica having record sales in 1990 and after 242 years replaced by Wikipedia that was only born in 2001. The last comprehensive UN Habitat Global Report on Cities was in the year 2020, when there were almost 2,000 metropolises, each with more than 300,000 inhabitants, being a third of the global population. In that year, the UN Statistical Commission endorsed a global definition of cities to facilitate international comparison. It defined a metropolitan area as a city and commuting zone which consists of suburban, peri-urban and rural areas economically and socially linked to the city. Adding to this definition, the sustainable boundaries of open spaces for food security, livelihood, leisure, heritage and well-being, and areas of mutual independence reflecting the true meaning of a metropolis as a mother city. Since 2007, there's been exponential growth in urbanization, with, according to UN Habitat statistics, a new metropolis will evolve every 2 weeks over the next 15 years for a total of 429 metropolises. By 2032, the metropolises will represent the human settlement typology with the largest population. This will leave the city defined by administrative formula as an unsustainable entity in addressing urban crisis, both natural and urban. But this attitude of the city is not new and can be seen in the reactions to the Industrial Revolution by William Morris in News from Nowhere in 1890, and Ebenezer Howard in his seminal book on Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, all taking their cue from utopia depicted by Thomas More of the 16th century. Howard lists the town magnates with their advantages and disadvantages of town life with a similar format for a country magnate, while the third maglet, which he recommends, is that his concept of town and country, a reincarnation of the historic metropolis. But it was the suburban railway that furthered the idea and made it real, with a move to Edgware and trains every 9 minutes, or living in Golders Green, the soonest reached in any time a place of delightful prospects. This was already recognized in the research of 1912, evaluating the influences of the Austro-Hungarian railway networks with the isochron. But there were critics to this movement. With the term metropolis, we recoined by Patrick Geddes in his 1915 book, Cities in Evolution, then used by Springer in The Decline of the West, and later by Lewis Mumford in his 1938 book, The Culture of Cities, describing it as the first stage in urban overdevelopment and social decline and decadence. The word received added exposure in 1927 with the German expressionist science fiction silent film directed by Fritz Lang, set in a futuristic urban dystopia. During the 20th century, two key changes took place. One, the urban planning and infrastructure growth with the rise of public transportation skyscrapers, and two, globalization and digital transformations with cities becoming interconnected through technology, finance, international trade, solidifying the influence. Around the turning point between these two changes, the Brundtland Report on Our Common Future in 1987 offered an agenda advocating the growth of economics based on policies that do not harm and can even enhance the environment. The time had come for a marriage of economy and ecology in order to ensure the growth of human progress through development without bankrupting the resources of future generations. Sustainable development was defined that meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But it also, everybody knows that, but it also contained two concepts which people forget. The concept of needs about the world's poor, addressing the issue of gap, economic gap, which was mentioned in the previous lecture, and also the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. David Reed, in fact, questions whether it is meaningful to talk of temporal sustainable development when we have no certainty of the needs of future generations, the ecological, social, economic conditions as representing a sustainable state. How close we may be to such conditions, he implies that we need to consider where this is an imprecise idealism unchecked by reality. In fact, Mrs. Brundtland would have had no idea in 1987 about what was happening in Facebook in our decade. In parallel, the World Heritage Committee at the turn of the century was confronted with new developments challenging the accepted definition of urban heritage. The 2005 debate resulted in the Vienna Memorandum managing the historic urban landscape. This was a paradigm shift from addressing monuments to include living cities and metropolises, as with the opportunities and challenges of tomorrow, we cannot solve the urban problems of today with the architectural tools of yesterday. The resulting 6-year travelling debate around the world brought about the approval in the 2011 of the recommendation on the historic urban landscape. However, the shift from an emphasis on the architectural monuments towards a broader recognition of the importance of social, cultural, economic processes had to be then come with a new understanding of the way that it had to be put together. The body of knowledge and case studies which have been developed of the historic urban landscape provided a basis to discuss the future challenges of the metropolis, as a recommendation determined that the city is beyond the large group of buildings and conversely the metropolis is beyond the large city. The discussion on heritage was gaining momentum with global debates on the future we want, to include culture together with proponents as Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner for contributions to welfare economics, in determining that cultural matters are integral parts of the lives we lead. If development can be seen as enhancement of our living standards, then efforts geared to development can hardly ignore the world of culture. Inequalities, poverty, and the environmental crisis were high on the agenda, and this was a lead-up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals that were finally adopted in 2015, and where a series of goals were addressed directly or with specific or indirect reference to culture. The key reference is essentially in Goal 11 in making cities and human settlements safe, resilient, and sustainable. And there were four relevant targets which we are looking at: strengthening the efforts to protect the world's cultural and natural heritage and provide universal access to open, green and public spaces. The urban crisis was looming on the horizon, with the need for making Goal 11 and discussing a specific role for a goal for culture, raise the issue of relevant models for culture, whether they be culture for, culture as, or culture in sustainable development. This brought about a 2016 global report on culture for sustainable development entitled Culture, Urban Future, and which was presented at UN Habitat 3 in Quito. The report is a key accompanying document to the new urban agenda adopted at that session. It recognized that culture should be taken into account in the promotion and implementation in planning. And also, it should include culture as a priority component of urban plans and strategies in the adaptation of planning instruments. It has 6 references to culture as a noun and 15 references to culture as an adjective: cultural interactions, cultural development, cultural diversity, cultural expressions, and in brackets you can see the number of paragraphs that it related to. The new urban agenda also defined a new dimension beyond social and economic and environmental aspect, which we all know about spatial sustainability as a 4th dimension. Temporal sustainability was considered beyond the biblical generations. Karl Mannheim, in his seminal paper on the problem of generations, defined a generation not just chronologically, but as a group of individuals of similar ages whose members have experienced a historical event within a set period of time. We would be considered the October 7th generation. Biblical generations of decades became more complex, with generations of technology in periods of months. David Ree's cynical comment as to our capacity of knowing the needs of future generations adds the dimension of topos to chronos, highlights spatial sustainability and the role of the metropolis, thereby providing for the capacities to manage polycrises. A key spatial sustainability as a concept suggests the spatial conditions of a city can enhance its power to generate social, economic, and environmental value and well-being. And what we're looking at essentially is the polycrisis, the compounded crises. The urban-rural linkages as the physical form of the metropolis coalescing culture and nature, which is the result of intentional planning and development, is critical to urban social, economic, and environmental well-being. In the concepts of disruption in cities, treating crisis as a single process or event is becoming increasingly untenable. Many contemporary urban crises cannot be untied from one another, and assigning causes, impacts, and responses is not a clear-cut task. A perspective of compound crisis, emphasizing interconnections between these issues, overlapping and varying over time, creating bundles of interlinked challenges. Linking cultural and natural heritage is an essential element of the metropolis. For this, there are a number of conventions, recommendations, and mechanisms that need to be brought to the table. These include the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, Man and Biosphere Programme, already in 1972, the Cultural Landscapes of 1992, together with Urban Protected Areas, and the FAO, a globally important agricultural heritage systems. The discourse on urbanization must depart from the traditional and outdated dichotomy of urban and rural areas. In order for them to be sustainable, they must develop in tandem. Inequalities must be reduced and the development gap bridged. Urban and rural spaces are inextricably linked economically, socially, and environmentally, and cannot be adequately dealt with in isolation from another. Recognizing this urban-rural continuum also highlights how partnerships, collaboration, and unity in action can yield dividends for all. The liminal spaces and peri-urban, the space around urban areas which merges into the rural landscape, is a zone of innovation, knowledge-based and globalized enterprise. It's also a place which attracts new ideas, new housing, multifunctional agriculture, providing opportunities in managing the urban crisis. Urban development puts peri-urban areas under particular pressure up to 4 times as fast as in urban areas. But the metropolis is a moving target, engulfing change and many times finding the areas of least resistance. In these dynamics, the role of cynicism, where surrounding historic communities are coalesced in growing conurbation, is critical in redefining identities and localizing behemoth. Hampstead in London is a classic example. With the transformative power of urbanization, the metropolis is a cultural construct providing an integrative approach to address polycrises that would add benefit to the rest of the city. The fragmentation of management has reduced many guidelines to a silo format where polycrises are not addressed. Cultural heritage will have to be sewn into the wider urban fabric and the natural assets through many programs, like we can see of healthy cities, sustainable cities, creative cities. Every UN institution has got their own city. But the digital revolution is more interesting to us because technologies are rapidly shifting from the centralized hierarchies, not really what is Facebook or what is Instagram, but to understand the real meaning of it. In fact, these are in fact moving from the centralized hierarchies to the distributed networks. It doesn't reside in Supermind, Superbook, or Superdatabase, but a complex relationship pattern of networks that coordinate human action. Technology now empowers individuals rather than external hierarchies. Even though hierarchies and bureaucracy do not innovate, free and empowered individuals do. Knowledge, innovation, spontaneity, self-reliance are becoming increasingly valued and promoted. So our UN Habitat Metropolis University initiative, which has been initiated by Bezalel with over 22 universities around the world, is foregrounding the mobilization of integrated approaches to national and cultural heritage. The metropolis needs to be considered as the new research topic to renew the heritage concept. Heritage constitutes a critical resource in fostering cultural resilience, empathy, and respect, in spite of Musk, and in the management of diverse societies and cultures that characterize many metropolises. So we now have then the city is more than a group of buildings, the metropolis is more than a large city, and then we have then a new problem. We cannot use the same language to actually address the issues of the metropolis. So when the city disintegrates into an archipelago of fragments, a new role is imposed on the landscape as a carrier of topographical characterizations, cohesion and continuity. And then in the bottom line of that is that the compositional structure that addresses fragmentation and disorientation without relapsing into the utopian forms of Ebenezer Howard of the traditional city that have proven inadequate for the metropolitan condition. It's really a play on words of the double meaning of multiplicities or multiple cities. And this was developed by Bergson with a theory which distinguished 2 types of multiplicity, that of continuous multiplicities, of being qualitative, and discrete multiplicities, which are qualitative. It is, in fact, the distinct parts of the city which are quantitative, and also the continuity and indivisibility which relates to which is really critical. Gilles Deleuze developed Bergson's theory. A multiplicity is, in the most basic sense, a complex structure that does not reference a prior unity. Multiplicities are not parts of a greater whole that have been fragmented, and they cannot be considered manifold expressions of a single concept or transcendent unity. It's really an oxymoron of the metropolis being the greater whole and the distinct neighborhoods. So let us then look at the issues of identifying the various parts which make up the metropolis. The first one of urban identity. So the heritage is a key in providing identity. A city identity takes shape at every level. Many people in a research that we've done were asked to define themselves in one word, and most of them would define themselves by the city they live in, not by the country. This will range from a historical and traditional image of the city through the identity of a neighborhood within the city, which changes the level of prosperity and the origin of the professions of the inhabitants, to the identity of individual inhabitants in relation to those around them. The identity of the culture of any neighborhood can depend just as much on the facilities it enjoys, the cafes, the bars, and as the people who live them. Our individual and collective identities are defined by the narratives we tell about them. Urban identity is a multifaceted concept that encompasses different aspects of built heritage, urban and natural environment. And in fact, that incorporates the notions of history and culture, urban environment, social behavior, and everyday life. It is influenced by social and economic factors. The research said that the city identity crisis facing cities worldwide is the interruption of historical traditions, the dominance of rapid urbanization, and the decline of economy in reality. Additionally, the pandemics altered the way people perceive and use urban space, which may also influence then their perception of urban identities. Both physical and social cognitive aspects are recognized in the study of urban identity. This brings us to the issues of inclusive communities. The NARA document highlights the need to create and recognize cultural diversities whereby all cultures and societies are rooted in the particular forms and means of tangible and intangible expressions and constitute their heritage, and these should be respected. The cultural heritage of each is the cultural heritage of all. Responsibility for cultural heritage and the management of it belongs in the first place to the cultural community that has created it and is subsequently to that which cares for it. And this responds, therefore, to the dynamics of space which cities are so critical to relate to. And this can be seen in the current debate on the definition of European identity. It's never been something which could be identified particularly. Just send your DNA for a lab test and see what happens. Acculturation is the dynamic and multidimensional process of adaptation that occurs when distinct cultures come in sustained contact, a process that has been continuing for centuries. The transformations and sustainability of urban communities has long been an issue around the world, but with increased mobility, both real and virtual, the effects of the speed of change and socioeconomics of the city has led to a need for a reappraisal of the methods and ways that these challenges and opportunities are met. So, the spatial growth of the city. Cities grow spatially in different ways. When they become then metropolises. 4 types of spatial growth of a city or area are identified. In a monocultural structure, a core city is growing outward from a central core in concentric circles over time. A polycentric structure, which you can see in figure 3, results from growth that is a matter of synergism, integration of various areas, then an outward expansion of a core area. A number of urban sub-centres may exist and grow, and over time become sufficiently close to a main city from a transport perspective. To allow significant business interaction and daily commuting, a polycentric structure tends to evolve toward a multipolar one, which is figure 4, which is characterized by a core city and various secondary sub-centers, with areas between becoming denser in population, forming contiguous urban settlements, the challenge of the metropolis. The next point, so if there's identity, there's diversities, we also have then the importance of redundancy. As a younger person, I always thought that redundancy was a waste of time and waste of money. But in fact, nature works very, very carefully with redundancy. The classic mango tree has so many blossoms, but they only have the number of fruit that it gives is in no proportion to the blossom that it actually has to give. In other words, to deal with crisis, you need redundancy is the bottom line. So nature encouraged the mango to blossom profusely beyond the single fruit. A culture capable of achieving resilience involves a continuous process of self-adaptation. According to this view, communities and nations, as well as investments, heritage, objects, cities and settlements, are possessed of this unique capacity. We can just see it in Jerusalem when they're stopping the tram for 14 weeks and the whole place is completely confused. The polynuclear metropolis provides this resilience, and together with the survival of the adaptive, which can be seen when major infrastructures have the capacity of reinventing themselves, as this motorway in Seoul in Korea. The polynuclear metropolis also has the capacity for cooling the city, providing a socio-economic balance between historic areas and commercial interests that can be seen in the new commercial center around Beijing, far from the World Heritage sites of the Forbidden City and the urban access, as photograph which I took from the Forbidden City of Shaoyang, which is the polycentric center 10 kilometers away. So, what are first of all, the preliminary findings? If we want to address then polycrisis, then research suggests that the original concept of heritage may have to be adaptive if not reviewed. In situations where the territorial dynamics and socio-political context become fluid, multicultural, multi-ethnic, in a world where classic integration and assimilation policies are no longer straightforward, due to the ease of communication, go beyond their original context. In the digital and globalization era, these processes allow us to reinterpret the role of heritage. Addressing the building of the metropolis as a political entity, the question of multiplicities of social identities is critical in the metropolitan context, and heritage is a key component of metropolitan culture. The feeling of metropolitan ownership is a social construct using diverse ways between metropolitan marketing, political arrangements, and social representation. What then are the contemporary values to evaluate the future metropolitan heritage, taking these opportunities to manage the roller coaster urban transformations? Coming closer to home, we're looking at Israeli and Palestinian populations of 10 and 5.2 million people, respectively. With the current situation, Israel and Palestine may be considered as island states functioning as single entities. This is a crisis in itself, needing regional cooperation, with regionality generating as a catalyst or as a facilitator. However, the existence of a great number of local authorities stymies the sustainable development both within Israel and beyond its borders. There were a total of 256 local authorities divided into 80 municipalities, 122 local and 54 regional councils. Each type of local authority operates under a different system. There are 96 Palestinian municipalities in the West Bank, 25 in Gaza, and 355 village councils. This is not unusual. Paris Metropolis, which is the equivalent of Israel and Palestine of well over 13 million, has well over 1,000 municipalities, dozens of intermunicipalities, 8 departments and 1 region, making it difficult to create an efficient metropolitan governance. On the other hand, we have Beijing with a single municipality for 22 million inhabitants. Building a process for establishing an efficient governance system can take decades, as experienced in Italy, where 10 metropolises have been created after a long process. The support of a metropolitan planning agency is an essential tool to manage changing governance systems and urban crises. And this could be done in one way: the survival of the adaptive, the adapting to manage through redundancy. And perhaps the strategy must be that there's no strategy. Beyond the local government, there are national authorities, municipal associations and clusters. The authorities under ministerial responsibility include, inter alia, drainage authorities, metro authorities. There are, in fact, 29 formal municipal associations managing regional responsibilities for environment, sanitation, sewage, education, and doing a lot of things that municipalities should be doing anyway. But what's more interesting are the clusters. The inception began in 2007 with the voluntary establishment of the Western Galilee cluster based on cooperation agreements between local authorities and inspired by the French territorial model. Based on the quintuple helix, the board of directors includes representatives from the public, the business and third sectors, and academia. The essential principle in cluster establishment and operation is in its voluntariness, whereby municipalities join the cluster willingly and commit to regional cooperation. The difference between the authority which is doing legal responsibility activity as opposed to the cluster which is doing voluntary, making things a little bit better. It provides added value to the individual communities and municipalities through a regional vision and strategic planning based on mapping regional assets and understanding local needs. The unique identities of each municipality harnesses the natural and cultural heritage of the cluster parts with a multidisciplinary approach and a common language. It may foster added community values as improved services or new economic processes as geotourism. For the last part, I would just like to say is that we at Metropolis, the UN Habitat University Consortium, we've taken on board some issues which is in our part of the world, and that is looking at Jerusalem and Gaza as a metropolis. So do we have some formula which can be applied in polycrisis? Jerusalem and Gaza may provide a small political window to reconsider transboundary metropolises for peace and cooperation, each by themselves not being sustainable entities. Beyond the existing paradigms in the digital age, new approaches are proposed by adopting cutting-edge professional and academic texts from UNESCO in Jerusalem and UN Habitat in Gaza. In considering the potential role of UNESCO in Jerusalem, it would be necessary to reread the organization's constitution as written during the dying embers of the Second World War in 1945. The text unequivocally states the importance of promoting collaboration amongst nations to contribute for peace and security in all branches of intellectual activity. This was interpreted by the United Nations in the 1947 partition resolution, recommending that Jerusalem and the surroundings, including Bethlehem, El Azariah, Bethany, also Ma'ale Adumim and Motza, if I want to then define the space which was declared, be placed under special international regime, a corpus separatum, and outside both the Jewish and Arab states. Revisiting this space in light of the proposed Jerusalem Metropolitan Law may add a new dimension to internationalization and management of regional transboundary cooperation. If we have, in fact, two kids fighting about a football, you take two of them by the scruff of the neck, take them away, and then move things out. So the idea was of taking outside of the Jerusalem, take people out of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, not physically, but then to redefine then the spaces within. But the shadow of the growing political Arab-Jewish conflict overtook the idyllic ecumenical vision, and internationalization did not occur. Instead, it was the armistice agreement. The political, social, and cultural religious implications can be evaluated within the spheres of global influence, while the will and resilience of the citizens needs to be seen in the context of the magnitude of their persuasion and moral courage. Over the past year, we have been involved in a Palestinian-Israeli activity which is looking at Gaza as a vision of hope and applying then the polynuclear center and transboundary metropolis. It was initiated in a study called Antidon, a vision of hope, the Greek name of the Gaza port during the Hellenistic rule of almost 1,000 years. This applies the Metropolis approach to engage cultural and natural heritage in the transboundary metropolis of Egypt, Palestine, and Israel, addressing the diversities of urban polycrises. This was presented at the UN Habitat World Urban Forum in Cairo last November. Solutions naturally are focusing now on the short term, while the long term is reduced to insular proposals. The Gaza as a strip is unsustainable and can only exist and thrive within its regional context. We must create a paradigm shift and not just reconstruct and rebuild the physical fabric, but a new vision to address violence and fear, hate and mistrust. Therefore, the emotional and physical elements must be intertwined as a key factor in the vision. Recreating an identity can offer a vision of hope through engaging the common or shared cultural and natural heritage, modularity, coalescing to a future whole with people to people. Reconnecting Gaza, we must stress the history of Gaza and Ashkelon. It was a hub and very much connected to the world. It will regain its regional role when the human dimensions are given priority. The natural environment and cultural histories are key elements that may be forces for common future and reconciliation. Not just simply then the Silk Roads, but also the incense route. Our presentation has been presented in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The idea, therefore, is to be involved beyond the economic base, that it includes heritage, cultural life and education as essential drivers for recovery from the destruction. The natural heritage will define the environmental ecosystems based on geomorphology, Kurkar ridges, water catchment, and migratory flyways. The cultural heritage will highlight the cultural itineraries, including the biblical Pentapolis, the Roman limes, Nabatean trading routes, and the historic sites and archaeological tells. Linking culture and nature may provide a rich mosaic of uses with a unique identity, strengthening the Gaza hub based on traditions of incense, spice, and Gaza. The Marshall Plan was economy. There we can see the ecosystems. The Marshall Plan was economy focused, determining that the remedy lies in breaking the vicious circle and restoring the confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries. The manufacturer and the farmer throughout this wide area must be able and willing to exchange their products for currencies, the continuing value which is not open to question. The text is chilling. This was written in 1946. Aside from the demoralizing effect on the world at large and the possibilities of disturbances arising from the desperation of the people concerned, the consequences to the economy of the world, should be apparent to all. It is logical that the world should do whatever it is possible to assist in the return of normal economic health. Without there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. So, the role of heritage and the metropolis is in creating a new transboundary metropolis, addressing the environmental challenges of the region in population growth, renewable energies, water, circular economies based on cultural and natural heritage. The transboundary metropolis of the future is Rafiah, Khan Yunis, Gaza, Ashkelon, Sderot, Netivot on the Via Maris as part of the port of the incense route with Gaza, Ashkelon as its capital. This has also been, Heritopolis has added the Antidon initiative to the European framework of the Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontière. And the Borders Forum brings the issues of transboundary activities to the front. We're not an exceptional case, we are an extreme case of a universal phenomenon. They, in fact, during the World Cup, closed the borders between Belgium and France. Tackling the impact of such crises, whether they stem from natural hazards, armed conflict, or actual urban distress, requires responses that consider the needs of all social groups and provides opportunities for social inclusion and economic development, while also acknowledging the specific needs, priorities, and identities of communities. By addressing those challenges, Heritopolis envisages a transformative future for the region. I also have a quote as an epilogue. My quote is from Don Quixote. When the life itself seems lunatic, who knows where madness lies? Perhaps to be too practical is madness, to surrender dreams, this may be madness. Too much sanity may be madness, and maddest of all, to see life as it is and not as it should be. Thank you.
I suppose Michael will be staying with us for lunch, and so we can raise issues and discuss with him his quite extraordinary idea. I myself have been quite interested in the idea of finding some peace in the metropolis rather than in the state. So I'll be very, and of course, once you mention the use of renewable energy and so on, I should tell actually the crowd that in 2007 I was very close to actually build such a city in the country of Belize, of all places, with an incredible developer from the United States. We came close, we had all the basics sorted out, and then the financial crisis of 2007 killed it. But it was an effort very much along the lines that you suggest here, so I'm very much intrigued. And without further ado, I'd like to, speaking of renewable energy and everything that has to do with sustainability, I would like to invite Miranda to talk to us about multidimensional, the multidimensionality of challenges in Germany in these days. So please, or in Europe.
So, Itai, thank you so much for the invitation to join the conference. I see Boris Mintz sitting here in the audience, and it's really wonderful that you're here. Thank you so much. Today, I would like to give you a talk that in some ways is very broad, but has some important implications to maybe also Israel, the question of where is the world going? So let's see if I can figure out. Okay. So I would like to begin with a little bit of a look at where the world stands economically. So on the left, you see the world's global export leaders. And not surprising, you see two pretty big circles, China, the United States. You also see Germany is quite big. And if we look at this graph, we can also see it a slightly different way, where no, that's not going to work. In the top left-hand area, you could say that's the European Union. We have North America, and we have very broadly defined Asia. Now look at the right-hand side, and you have the world economy in 2023, and you see how big the United States and China are. We see the European Union. Notice Russia is part of Europe here. So it's not really the European Union, the pink area here. It's also broader Europe. But you can see how dominant two players are here, the US and China. My talk today will look at the US and China and think about the implications for Europe. And I think we could probably put Israel sort of as part of Europe, although it has strong ties to the United States and some connections to other parts of the world. I'm also going to link the talk today to global carbon dioxide emissions, climate change, a word that increasingly is being raised as a politically no-go area. It's like a four-letter word. Don't say it, climate change, right? What we see is global CO2 emissions continue to rise. If we go back to the 1750s, that's the pre-industrial period, 1900 is when we start to see North America and Europe growing their emissions. That continues through World War II into the 1945-50s. And slowly after World War II, more countries are joining the global economic growth period. And now we see emissions are very, very strongly shifting towards Asia. And that's important for our story. Carbon emissions today, China, by far the world's largest CO2 emitter. China is 30% of global CO2 emissions. The United States, about 14%. Now look at Europe here. You see Europe? Bottom left, Europe is down to 7% of global emissions. Although, if we go back to 1900, Europe was the main emitter for global CO2 emissions. And we see this here. Something that's very important is the year 2003. Chinese emissions overtook American emissions. So until 2003, the United States was the biggest emitter. Now China is the biggest emitter. We can also look at per capita CO2 emissions. So if we look at per capita CO2 emissions, the world looks a little differently. And if you're China, this is an important part of the story. If you're China, you would continue to say America's the problem. The United States is the cause of the global climate crisis. Although notice Chinese per capita emissions are now larger than German per capita emissions. So China as a country has grown economically to the point that despite a population of 1.4 billion people, Chinese per capita emissions are larger than German. Now, I want to look at this story, and I want to look at it in connection to politics, also in the United States. So if we go to how the previous administration, if we look at the administration of Joseph Biden, I think you could say he recognized something that was starting to go on, and that is that not only was China the largest emitter of CO2 emissions, but that China was becoming the largest economic power in relationship to addressing climate change. Who makes electric automobiles? Who makes the batteries? Who makes all of the wind turbines, the solar panels? 80% China. China is the country that not only was emitting the most, but was becoming the largest economic winner from climate change. So under the Biden administration, almost one of his first political moves was to say we need new legislation to promote environmental protection and to address climate change so that the United States could catch up economically again with China. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. It's the craziest name imaginable. It has nothing to do with inflation reduction. It's actually a climate law. But you couldn't call it a climate law because you can't use the word climate change in the United States. So the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act had $369 billion US dollars. That's a huge sum of money for clean energy and to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And a target was set to reduce emissions 42% below 2030 levels, so really to give a big push to moving forward on greenhouse gas emission reduction. We also, under the Biden administration, had what they called a bipartisan legislation, voted on by Democrats plus a handful of Republicans, still called bipartisan, the Infrastructure Act, meant to build infrastructure for dealing with roads and highways that are in very bad condition in the US, but also for building out the electric grid for renewable energy, for building wind turbine parks, etc. So we see here an effort by the Biden administration to do economic catch-up related to climate change. But now the story is dominated by another set of political views. So this takes us back 10 or 15 years in time. You may remember the Tea Party. The Tea Party is not a political party, it's a movement inside the Republican Party. And the Tea Party, I think this goes back also to what we were hearing in Bob Putnam's talk. What was going on that in the Republican Party you start to see the emergence of this climate skepticism. Now let's look at these quotes. The one on the left, coming from the US Senate. The idea that man-made gases, CO2, are causing catastrophic global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Who is the actor in this quote? There's no name given, but we can say it's China's greatest hoax on the American people. Climate change, no, that's a joke. You see here in the middle, a Tea Party representative. Global warming is a socialist scam. A socialist scam, i.e. not capitalist. It's Chinese, and it's a joke, a scam. It's snowing, obviously then global warming isn't happening. And you'll notice just in the far right here, I have the picture of the Koch brothers, who made their money on fossil fuels and who have supported political viewpoints anti-climate. So let's take a look at what Donald Trump has said about these things. And we'll go back to his first administration. We're January 2014 on the left, and we're up to 2018 on the right. It's snowing in Texas and Louisiana, record-setting freezing temperatures throughout the country and beyond. Global warming is an expensive hoax. The one on the bottom, 2014, 10 years ago already. Obama's war on coal is killing American jobs, making us more energy dependent on our enemies, and creating a great business disadvantage. That's key. Business disadvantage. So he's saying that actually this Chinese hoax is causing the American economy a big problem. On the right-hand side, Donald Trump says, I'm glad that my friend Emmanuel Macron and the protesters in Paris have agreed with the conclusion I reached 2 years ago. The Paris Agreement is fatally flawed because it raises the price of energy for responsible countries while whitewashing some of the worst polluters. Whitewashing China, raising prices for Americans. Americans are losing jobs. China's the problem. Now we come up to today. We're in this administration, 2025, January. One of the very first actions of the Trump administration, putting America first in international environmental agreements. And I'm going to read just a short piece of this. It's the policy of my administration to put the interests of the United States and the American people first in the development and negotiation of international environmental agreements with the potential to damage or stifle the American economy. This has nothing to do with climate change. This has to do with the American economy. These agreements must not unduly or unfairly burden the United States. So maybe you know that in the United States, recently, for the last 20 years, the United States has signed almost no international environmental agreements. It hasn't signed many agreements at all internationally. And that's in part because there's a sense in the US that those international agreements are bad for the American economy. And what else has the Trump administration done? It says restoring energy dominance. What is restoring energy dominance? It means fossil fuel development, more coal, more oil, more gas, opening federal lands to oil and energy exploration. This is the US Department of Energy that is now being told the focus needs to be on cheap oil and gas. But for climate change, what does this mean? Scientists brace for the worst as Trump purges climate mentions from websites. You can go now to any US government agency and look for the word climate change, and you'll find it, but you won't find anything underneath it. There's no information. So I did that. I went to several websites. The US Department of State negotiates international agreements for the US. This is the page on climate and environment. What does it say? US climate and environmental policy supports sustainable economic growth. Okay. Energy security and a healthy planet. The well-being of the natural world affects millions of US jobs and health. So the Department of State works with partners to advance US interests on such issues as combating wildlife trafficking, conserving nature, enhancing water security, and reducing harmful pollutants. Nothing but climate change there. It then says what the US has done, the Montreal Protocol, 1987, in case you forget, that's a long time ago. Some support for coral reefs. But it basically says we must leverage our strengths and do away with climate policies that weaken America. Well, we will not ignore threats to our natural environment and will support sensible environmental protections. The State Department will use diplomacy to help Trump fulfill his promise for a return to American energy dominance. This is the US Department of State climate change website. I looked at it again. What I showed you was 2 months ago. This is what the website says now. It's empty. You open it, the first link is to a 1925 article on US objects to sustainable aviation fuels. The next is a 2024 report. That's the US climate change website, which used to be one of the most informative websites on climate change. Okay, now let's talk about China. So, we know that the United States has been suffering economically. We heard about the economic inequality today in Robert Putnam's talk. What's going on in China? Well, first, what does President Xi say to what Donald Trump is doing? Very recently, April 24 this year, President Xi calls leaders together from around the world, a meeting on climate and the just transition, urgently jointly advancing global climate governance. What will China do? Look at the difference with the United States. China will adhere to multilateralism. China will deepen international cooperation to boost technological innovation and transformation. China will pursue South-South cooperation. And China is about to announce its new nationally determined contribution to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will be happening in Brazil later this year, to say China's going to do more. And I told you, China is winning when it comes to the technologies for clean energy. China's share of global clean tech manufacturing capacity, battery cells, it's increased from 78% to 84% in 2023. Electric vehicles, from 57% in 2 years' time, 67% of electric vehicle production capacity is in China. Solar modules, 82%. Wind turbines, 64%. China is dominating in the production of the technologies of the future. And note, the International Energy Agency predicts that the clean tech market will rise from $700 billion in 2023 to over $2 trillion a decade from now. This is one of the industries of the future. And who's playing? China. Where's the US? We can look even more detailed. China dominates the clean tech supply chains. Solar modules, solar cells, solar wafers and ingots, polysilicon, battery slurries, and down the list we go. In all of these areas, China is manufacturing over 80% of the parts that we need for renewable energy technologies. So you know there's a trade war going on now, and the United States has, under the Trump administration, put tariffs on Chinese products. Will China lose this economic competition? Well, let's see, how dependent is China on the US market? It's not that dependent, because in 2014, the Trump administration put the first tariffs on China. And since then, China has been diversifying its supply chains and diversifying its export markets. So in some areas, consumer electronics, 1/5 of its exports, China's exports, go to the US. But look down the list, it's usually more around 15 or 10% or less. So yes, the tariffs hurt China, but China will not fall because of these tariffs. And you'll notice they just had an agreement with China and the US. They said, okay, we'll reduce our tariffs, 10% each. Trump thought that China would break. China will not break. China will win, if you ask me, this competition. So now let's take a look at China and its foreign policy. I didn't mention before that the United States has cut its aid, U.S. Department for International Development. The agency has been drastically cut, and almost all USAID projects have been stopped. So no funding right now for the USAID. And what is China doing? China is moving in. China is funding development throughout East and Southeast Asia and increasingly into Africa. So the US is pulling out. China, if you ask me, is moving in. And something else is going on because China is shifting its focus on clean tech exports. The clean tech exports used to go to the EU and the US. They still do. But look at the global south, the blue-green line. China is shifting its export markets from the West to South and Southeast Asia. Why? Because where is the growth market of the future? It's not in Europe. It's not in the US. The growth market of the future is in India and Pakistan and Indonesia and Bangladesh. China's enhanced advancement in the global south happening at the same time USAID is being dismantled. This is the website of USAID. There is nothing there. Everyone I know in the United States who works with USAID is in big trouble right now. They're losing their jobs, they're losing their projects, they have a big gap going on right now. The global market growth, what is predicted? That the global market growth, you can take a look, 2000, 2050, 2100, the share of that growth that is in the West relative to the share of that growth that is in the regions where China is now investing in its foreign policy, in Asia and in Africa. That's where population is growing. Africa's population is expected to double by around 2050, and Asia. So what does this mean for the European Union? What does this mean for maybe also Israel? In 2019, before the Trump second administration, in reaction to the developments in China, the European Union said, wait, the European Union is where climate action has been concentrated. Europe is the leader on climate change. Europe is the country or the region that has pushed forward on the international climate negotiations. But we're losing to China. So in 2019, in relationship to the developments in China, the European Commission passed the Green Deal Industrial Plan. And the Green Deal Industrial Plan is linked to the European Green Deal. And it basically says Europe needs to change its economy. It needs to change how it does economics. It needs to focus on becoming the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It needs to change from importing resources to circular economy. Take your waste, recycle it, find the products in your own waste, import less. It means an agriculture that doesn't use pesticides. It means an agriculture that's very modern. It means a renewable energy infrastructure, so you don't have to import energy from abroad. It means changing your transport system so it doesn't use conventional automobiles. This is 2019. And in 2019, companies already began to say, we won't be able to do this because over there in China or in India or maybe South Africa, they can do it without all of these regulations. So Europe said, we need a carbon border adjustment mechanism. We have to put a tariff on incoming products that don't meet our environmental standards. So if the automobile is being produced in China, but with weaker environmental standards, they'll have to pay an extra tax when they sell that product in China. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is supposed to start next year, 2026. So China, of course, doesn't like this, but what about the United States? So I mentioned that Europe wants to be, once again, the climate leader. And to do that, Europe has set some ambitious targets. I put Norway here because I also just gave this talk in Norway. The European Union and Norway have both taken on a 2050 climate neutrality target. And to get there, by 2030, in 5 years' time, emissions are supposed to be 55% below the level of 1990. Today, they're about 45% below. So another 10% by 2030. And then climate neutrality by 2050. Climate neutrality means any emissions that go up have to be taken back out. Planting trees, carbon capture and storage, but you can't have very many emissions. So this is industrial policy, right? Government says this is the target, and now industry has to work with us to get there. That was 2019. 2022. The war on Ukraine totally changed European energy policy. So that Europe, which was totally dependent on Russia, 44% of its coal, 41% of its gas, 27% of its oil was coming from Russia. And the European Union said, we can't do this. And they introduced all kinds of policies so that today in Germany, we don't have any more oil or coal or gas being imported. In Hungary, they still have a little bit of gas being imported. But it's shifted dramatically so that now Norway's the winner. Norway is now exporting gas to the European Union in a much bigger way than before. And they're also making a lot of profits in the process. But what has happened is that instead of Europe getting its energy now from Russia, it's getting its energy from within, from Norway, and increasingly importing liquid natural gas from the United States and somewhat from the Middle East. Qatar is now a big supplier to Europe. So the idea that China is the big competition, and then this war with Ukraine, where Europe realized materials can be a political weapon. Energy can be a political weapon. So the idea of becoming more energy independent is also a way of saying we need to be more resilient against changes in the geopolitics in the world. Well, the same thinking is becoming increasingly strong now in relationship to the critical raw minerals. The critical raw minerals are what we need in order to build batteries like lithium, or the cobalt, or the products that go into manufacturing solar PVs and wind turbines. And the question is, where do we get these rare earth minerals? China again dominates. The rare earth minerals are 80% plus coming from China. So, sorry, that wasn't supposed to be there. So what this means is that Europe is now really pushing not just on CO2 emission reductions and energy efficiency and its own renewable energy production, but it's starting to say we need a circular economy because maybe those renewable energy inputs, those critical raw minerals, will not be available to us in the future. If we compare where Europe stands with China and the US, you can see that China dominates on the clean tech exports, much more so than the US. The EU 27 is not doing too badly, but all of these policies are trying to push forward and say Europe needs to do more to stay competitive in the industries of the future. And that's particularly true for Germany. Germany is 20% of the European Union economy. Germany is also the manufacturing hub of Europe. So Germany has done a lot with pushing forward on clean tech manufacture, the upper yellow line. And that's brought jobs. We can see the number of jobs we have in Europe that are related to the clean tech industry. Heat pumps, solar photovoltaics, solar biomass. We're now talking about millions of jobs in Europe based on these technologies. So critical is this for Europe that just at the beginning of last year, Europe said we need to do more. That 2019 Industrial Green Deal wasn't enough. We need a Net Zero Industry Act. And the Net Zero Industry Act is trying to find a way to keep Europe competitive in what we see as the economy of the future. Anybody who's done business in Europe knows Europe has lots of bureaucracy. Europe has lots of paperwork. Europe has lots of rules, and sometimes the rules from here and the rules from there contradict each other. So there's an effort to say we need to simplify permitting, we need to support projects, we need to define the rules that make it more attractive to invest in Europe. Same thing maybe in Israel. You invent. You're an innovation society. But who takes that innovation and builds on it and makes the money off of it? Nowadays, in Europe, when we invent, it's bought up either by the US or by China. And so the capital isn't necessarily staying in Europe. The objectives of the Net Zero Industry Act are to promote investments, enhance production capacity of the key products for securing the EU's climate neutrality goals. And remember, the goals are higher than anywhere else. China's climate neutrality goal is 2060. Europe is 2050. If you can get there first, maybe you win that technological competition. And the act goes into all kinds of different areas. I just took one screenshot, but it's onshore wind, it's batteries, CO2 capture and storage, biomethane and biogas. But what just happened? On batteries, Europe's hopes on a Swedish battery firm just collapsed because they went bankrupt. What's happening with onshore and offshore wind? We'll get back to that. The Trump administration, a lot of this investment goes back to Joseph Biden. The Infrastructure Act, investing in clean renewable energies. The Trump administration is ending many of these programs. So the question I raise for all of you to think about is, are we in a historical turning point right now? Europe has always thought of itself as the most important ally of the United States. But if you look at recent reporting, look what this says. Far right. Europeans think the US is a necessary partner, but not an ally. Politico just reports here, the majority of Europeans see Trump as an enemy, according to the survey. Top left, under Trump, a US that once united Europe now divides it. Bottom left, Trump's tariff deals send Europe to the back of the line. This is the most recent article. Trump calls the European Union nastier than China. The EU is taking a deep breath. And if you read the article, it basically says, Europe was always the country that got the first telephone call from the American president. Actually, it was Canada, but Europe came second. But now what's happened? The first foreign visit is to the Middle East. And Europe has been trying to negotiate on those tariffs, and it can't get a seat at the table. Norway, the world's biggest pension fund. Norway, because of the climate focus of Europe, said we're not going to invest our money anymore from our pension fund into coal. We're not going to invest our money anymore from the pension fund into non-clean tech areas. What has the Trump administration done? It says, well, we're going to stop those Norwegian projects in the United States. Equinor, one of the world's largest energy companies, was building a huge offshore wind park on the east coast of the United States off of New York, and that project has been stopped by the Trump administration. And my very last slide. Italy's Meloni, May 17th. That's just yesterday, day before. Italy's Meloni warns the European Union green policies risk the industrial desertification of Europe. So I mentioned that the Trump administration is dividing Europe. And in this you can see some of that division. On the left is our new chancellor in Germany, Merz. Friedrich Merz comes from the Christian Democratic Union. The Christian Democratic Union is a conservative party, but conservative in a European sense. Conservative would be like the Democrats in the United States. The Christian Democratic Union was Angela Merkel's party, and the party that's really pushed forward on climate change, along with the Green Party and the Social Democratic Party. But the party is shifting to the right because we have a growing far right in Europe. 20% of the German population voted for the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, a party that is anti-immigrant. And now, 10 years ago, no, but now they say we don't believe in climate change. They're taking on the debates that we've had in the United States and bringing them to Europe. The majority of Germans, the majority of Europeans still believe in climate change. The majority of Europeans still want to have an industrial transformation to a green future. But what we're seeing is Europe is being divided. And I think that if we are going to succeed with the climate challenge, then Europe needs to work on finding ways to continue to focus on the industries of the future. Europe can't do what the US does. Europe doesn't have fossil fuels. It can't go to an American Donald Trump path. It will lose. The only way I think Europe can survive in the future is if it can focus on the industries of the future, the clean tech industries, the digital industries, the pharmaceutical industries, and then we will see a more competitive Europe. And if not, then I think we will see a geopolitics very much dominated by a trade war between the United States and China. And that sums it all up. And Itai is telling me, Miranda, it's time to stop.
No, it's just that, lunch is being served in the garden downstairs. All the speakers, Michael and Miranda and others are going to join us. Also the speakers of the afternoon, so we can mingle, eat lunch, and have some wonderful discussions over what we just heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much.